My boyfriend called the police and had me arrested for assault. What he didn't know was that my security camera recorded everything. My name is Claire Bennett. I'm 29 years old, and 7 months ago, I spent a night in jail for a crime I didn't commit. Even now, it sounds ridiculous when I say it out loud. If you'd asked me back then what the biggest problem in my life was, I probably would have complained about work. Long hours, impossible deadlines, too much coffee, not enough sleep. Nothing unusual. I had a decent apartment, a steady career, good friends, and a boyfriend I thought I knew. His name was Ethan Parker. We'd been together for about a year and a half, and for most of that time, I would have described our relationship as solid, not perfect, but real. The kind of relationship where people start asking when you're getting engaged. Looking back, the warning signs were there the whole time. I just didn't recognize them for what they were. Most of them seemed small enough to ignore, and every time something happened, Ethan always had an explanation ready. The first time Ethan lost his temper, he apologized before I even had time to process what happened. He blamed stress at work. The second time, he blamed lack of sleep. The third time, he blamed a difficult client. Every explanation sounded reasonable enough on its own. I wanted to believe him. Looking back, that was probably why the pattern lasted as long as it did. I'd tell myself everyone had bad days, and that things would settle down once work became less stressful. The changes happened gradually enough that I never woke up one morning and thought, this relationship is becoming unhealthy. Instead, I kept making excuses for things that made me uncomfortable. Every time a boundary was crossed, I convinced myself it wasn't serious enough to leave over. Arguments became more frequent. His reactions became more intense. Sometimes he'd slam doors. Sometimes he'd throw things. Never directly at me, always near me. Close enough to make me flinch, far enough to deny that he'd intended any harm. The strange thing is that the incidents themselves weren't what stayed with me. What stayed with me was the way he'd watch me afterward, almost as if he was trying to figure out how much I was willing to tolerate. At the time, I didn't have words for that feeling. I just knew something felt off. A few weeks before everything fell apart, I started noticing that our arguments followed the same pattern every single time. It didn't matter how they started. Somehow they always ended with me defending myself against accusations that didn't make sense. If I worked late, I didn't care about the relationship. If I wanted time alone, I was being cold. If I disagreed with him, I was attacking him. Nothing was ever directly my fault, but somehow everything circled back to me anyway. I wish I could tell you there was one moment where I finally understood what was happening. There wasn't. The night everything happened started like any other Tuesday. Work had been brutal. I was behind on a project, my inbox was overflowing, and a major accident on the highway turned my commute into a nightmare. By the time I reached my apartment building, I felt like I'd already lived through 2 separate days. I remember sitting in my car for a minute before going upstairs. Just breathing, trying to gather enough energy to make dinner. The second I opened the apartment door, I knew something was wrong. The television wasn't on. The apartment was quiet. Ethan was sitting on the couch waiting for me. At first, I thought maybe he'd had a bad day. Then he looked up and said, "You're late." The tone immediately put me on edge. Not concerned. Not curious. Accusing. I dropped my keys by the door and explained about the accident on the highway. He laughed. Not a happy laugh. The kind people use when they've already decided you're lying. "Sure," he said. I stared at him. "What does that mean?" "It means you're always late lately." I was too tired for another pointless argument. "Ethan, traffic was awful." Or maybe you were somewhere else. For a second, I genuinely thought I'd misheard him. Somewhere else? He stood up. Maybe with someone else? I remember blinking at him, waiting for the punchline. It never came. He was serious. The accusation would have been funny under different circumstances. I was working 60-hour weeks and barely finding time to do laundry. The idea that I was somehow fitting a secret affair into my schedule was absurd, but Ethan wasn't joking. The longer he talked, the more convinced he seemed. By then I could feel a headache forming behind my eyes. I grabbed my purse and headed toward the bedroom. I am exhausted. I'm changing clothes. Of course he followed me. That was another thing that had become normal. Arguments never stayed where they started. If I walked away, he followed. If I asked for space, he ignored it. If I stopped responding, he kept talking until I did. By the time I reached the dresser, he was still going. I opened a drawer and grabbed a clean shirt while he listed everything I'd supposedly done wrong. I didn't respond. That only made him angrier. "You never listen." Silence. "You don't respect me." I kept changing. "You care more about your job than this relationship." I took a breath and tried not to engage. The problem with people looking for a fight is that silence often frustrates them more than arguing back. Eventually, Ethan stopped talking. For a second, I thought maybe it was over. Then he said, "You don't even care enough to answer me." I closed my eyes. Looking back, I should have kept my mouth shut. Instead, I said the one thing that triggered everything. "Can we talk about this when you've calmed down?" The room went completely still. I knew immediately I'd made a mistake. His expression changed so fast it was unsettling. "When I've calmed down?" That's not what I meant. "You think I'm crazy." "No. You think I'm unstable." "I didn't say that." "You didn't have to." His voice kept rising. The argument wasn't about me being late anymore, or cheating, or work. Now it was about him feeling insulted. I started backing away. "Ethan, stop." He shoved me before I could finish the sentence, hard enough that my shoulder hit the dresser. For a second, I just stared at him. I don't think I was scared yet. I was shocked. There was a part of me that still couldn't believe he'd crossed that line. Then he slapped me. The first hit happened so fast I barely processed it. The second one left no room for denial. My face burned. My ears rang. And something inside me finally snapped into focus. I wasn't dealing with an argument anymore. I was dealing with someone who had decided hurting me was acceptable. I stepped backward. "We're done." Instead of looking ashamed, he laughed. Actually laughed. Then he grabbed a framed photograph from the dresser and launched it across the room. Glass shattered against the wall. That was enough for me. I wasn't staying there another minute. "I'm leaving." I headed toward the door. He moved directly in front of it. "No." "What do you mean, no?" "You're not leaving." I tried to move around him. He grabbed my shirt with both hands and started yelling so close to my face I could feel spit hitting my skin. At that point, I wasn't trying to win the argument. I wasn't trying to prove anything. I just wanted out. I reached down, removed his hands from my shirt, and stepped around him. What happened next would have looked ridiculous if it hadn't nearly destroyed my life. The second I got past him, Ethan threw himself backward. Not stumbled, not lost balance. Threw himself backward. One moment he was standing. The next he was on the floor clutching his wrist and screaming. I froze. For a few seconds I genuinely couldn't understand what I was seeing. Then he grabbed his phone. That was the moment fear finally set in. Not of what he'd already done. Of what he was about to do. The moment Ethan picked up his phone, the atmosphere in the room changed. A few seconds earlier, he'd been screaming at me. His face had been red with anger, his voice loud enough that I wouldn't have been surprised if the neighbors could hear every word. Now he sounded terrified. The transformation was so fast it would have been impressive if it weren't happening to me. "Please help me," he said into the phone. "My girlfriend attacked me. She pushed me down. I think my wrist is broken." I stood there staring at him. A minute earlier, he'd been throwing things across the bedroom. Now he was crying, or pretending to. "That's not what happened," I said loudly. He ignored me and continued talking to the dispatcher, carefully describing a version of events that existed only in his imagination. When the call ended, something happened that still sticks with me. The tears disappeared. Just for a second. Long enough for him to look directly at me. His face was completely calm. No fear. No panic. No pain. Then the crying started again. "You're done," he said quietly. At the time, I thought he was bluffing. I honestly believed the police would show up, look around, see the broken glass, see the red mark on my face, and realize what had actually happened. 10 minutes later, I learned how naive that assumption was. When the officers arrived, Ethan met them at the door, looking like the world's most convincing victim. His eyes were red, his voice shook, and he never stopped holding his wrist. Meanwhile, I was standing there exhausted, overwhelmed, and trying to explain everything at once. "He hit me," I said immediately. "Look at my face." One of the officers glanced in my direction before turning back toward Ethan. That was the first moment I realized things were going badly. Ethan spoke first, and once he started talking, it felt like the entire direction of the conversation shifted. He told them I came home angry. He told them I started yelling. He told them I pushed him during an argument. Every sentence sounded more ridiculous than the one before it. I interrupted repeatedly. I pointed toward the bedroom. I explained the broken glass. I explained the slaps. I explained that he'd blocked the doorway when I tried to leave. None of it seemed to matter. The officers weren't rude. That almost made it worse. They simply looked at the situation and decided who they believed. And it wasn't me. A few minutes later, one of them turned toward me. "Ma'am, please place your hands behind your back." I genuinely thought I'd misheard him. "What?" "You are being placed under arrest." The room seemed to tilt sideways. I remember looking at Ethan, expecting some kind of reaction. Guilt. Regret. Anything. Instead, he kept staring at the floor while pretending to cry. The handcuffs clicked around my wrists. I can still remember that sound. I'd never been arrested before. I'd never even sat in the back of a police car. Watching my neighbors peek through their doors while officers escorted me out of the building was one of the most humiliating experiences of my life. Humiliation doesn't even begin to describe it. The entire ride to the station felt unreal. I kept thinking there had to be some mistake, some misunderstanding that would be cleared up the moment someone listened. That didn't happen. They processed me, photographed me. Fingerprinting came next. Then they put me in a holding cell. The hours after that blurred together. I sat on a hard bench staring at a concrete wall and replaying the night over and over again. I replayed every moment of that night, from the argument to the assault, and finally the phone call that changed everything. Every time I reached the end of the memory, I found myself asking the same question. How did this happen so fast? Less than 24 hours earlier, Ethan and I had been living together. Now I was sitting in jail because of him. The fear wasn't even the worst part. The worst part was not knowing what came next. Would this stay on my record? Would my employer find out? Would people believe him? Would my friends believe him? Those questions kept circling through my head until I felt physically sick. Sometime after sunrise, I was finally released. My best friend Rachel picked me up. The second I got into her car, I felt everything I'd been holding together start to crack. Rachel didn't pressure me to talk right away. She just drove. After a few minutes, she asked what happened. I told her everything. From the moment I walked through the apartment door until the moment the cell door closed behind me. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she sat quietly for a moment before asking a question that seemed almost unfair. Can you prove any of it? I opened my mouth, then stopped, because something clicked. Not gradually, all at once. A memory, a small detail I'd completely forgotten. Months earlier, after a break-in attempt in our building, I'd installed a security camera in the living room. The camera faced the front door and part of the hallway, including the entrance to the bedroom. My heart started racing. Rachel noticed immediately. What? The camera. She frowned. What camera? The security camera. I sat upright so fast she nearly swerved. It was the first hint of hope I'd felt since leaving the station. Maybe not confidence. Maybe not relief. But something close to hope. Because if the camera had recorded what happened, then the entire night existed somewhere outside of Ethan's lies. And if that footage was still there, it could change everything. When we got back to Rachel's apartment, I didn't even take my coat off before opening the security camera app. My hands were shaking badly enough that I entered my password wrong twice. The entire drive over, I'd been trying not to get my hopes up. Technology fails all the time. Cameras disconnect. Files get corrupted. Maybe the angle wasn't good enough. Maybe it hadn't captured anything useful. By the time the recordings finally loaded, I felt sick. I found the recording from Tuesday night and clicked play immediately. Rachel pulled a chair beside me, and together we watched the recording from the beginning. The footage started with me walking through the front door carrying my work bag. Even without hearing my voice, it was obvious I'd had a long day. My shoulders were slumped, and I moved like someone whose only goal was reaching the couch. Then Ethan appeared, waiting. The moment I saw him sitting there, I felt my stomach tighten all over again. The audio kicked in. Everything came back. The accusations, the questions, the suggestion that I'd been somewhere else, the implication that I was cheating. Watching it from the outside was strangely different from living through it. During the argument, I'd been focused on surviving the conversation. Looking at the footage later, I noticed details I'd missed. The way Ethan kept escalating whenever I tried to disengage. The way he followed me from room to room. The way every answer I gave seemed to make him angrier. Rachel watched quietly beside me. Neither of us spoke. Then we reached the bedroom. I heard myself say the sentence that had triggered the explosion. Can we talk about this when you've calmed down? The recording captured everything after that. Ethan shoved me into the dresser, slapped me twice, and threw the picture frame across the room. Watching it all unfold from the outside was somehow worse than living through it. There was no missing context and no room for interpretation. Everything that had happened was right there on the screen. Rachel actually paused the video after the second slap. Oh my God, I couldn't answer. I just kept staring at the screen. Part of me was relieved. Part of me was horrified. Because seeing something happen and watching it later are two different experiences. Watching the footage felt uncomfortable because it removed every excuse I'd been making for Ethan. There was no arguing with what was on the screen. And what happened looked bad. Really bad. We started the video again. This time we watched the part that mattered most. The part that had gotten me arrested. I watched Ethan grab my shirt. I watched myself remove his hands and step around him. Then, without any contact that could justify it, Ethan threw himself backward onto the floor. There was no other way to describe it. He wasn't pushed. He didn't trip. He wasn't defending himself. He simply dropped. Rachel looked at me, then back at the screen, then at me again. He planned this. I didn't answer immediately, because deep down, I had been thinking the same thing. The footage kept playing. Ethan lying on the floor. Ethan reaching for his phone. Ethan calmly preparing to call the police. What struck me most wasn't the fake fall. It was how quickly he switched personalities. The anger disappeared. The tears appeared. The victim performance started. And then came the call. We listened to him tell the dispatcher I had attacked him. The entire story was a lie, a complete fabrication. Yet he'd told it without hesitation. By the time the recording ended, the room was completely silent. Rachel finally leaned back in her chair. "Claire, this is insane." I nodded. It was. But for the first time since Tuesday night, I wasn't completely powerless anymore. The footage changed everything. I immediately downloaded the file, then downloaded it again, then sent copies to multiple email accounts. I uploaded backups to cloud storage and saved another copy to an external drive. Maybe it sounds excessive. After spending a night in jail for something I didn't do, it felt completely reasonable. There was no chance I was losing that footage, not after what it had already cost me. Later that morning, Rachel called someone she knew through work and got me an appointment with a lawyer. Her name was Victoria Lawson. She specialized in domestic violence cases and had been practicing for years. When I walked into her office, I expected skepticism. Honestly, I expected everyone to be skeptical. Instead, Victoria sat down, watched the footage from beginning to end, and barely said a word. When it finished, she folded her hands and looked directly at me. "How long have you had this recording?" "Since this morning." She nodded slowly. Victoria nodded after watching the footage. "Good," she said quietly. It wasn't excitement. It sounded more like relief that solid evidence actually existed. Then she leaned back in her chair. "Claire, this video changes the entire case." I felt myself exhale for what felt like the first time in days. "So they'll drop the charges?" "Most likely." Most likely wasn't the certainty I wanted, but it was enough to keep listening. Victoria opened a legal pad and started writing. "We need to submit the footage immediately. We also need copies of the police report, the arrest paperwork, and every communication Ethan has sent since the incident." I frowned. "He hasn't contacted me." "He will." The confidence in her voice surprised me. "What makes you think that?" She gave me a look that suggested she'd seen this situation before. People who create problems like this usually think they can control how the story ends. Once they realize they can't, they panic. She turned out to be right. By that evening, messages had already started arriving through Rachel. At first, they sounded almost sincere. "Please tell Claire I'm sorry." "Can we talk?" "I never wanted any of this. I miss her." Rachel showed me every message. I ignored them. A few hours later, the tone changed. The apologies disappeared. The frustration started showing. "Tell her she's making a mistake. Tell her she needs to stop. Tell her she pushed me too. Tell her my wrist still hurts." Rachel looked up from her phone. "He seems nervous." That was putting it mildly. The more he texted, the more obvious it became that something had shifted. Ethan didn't know exactly what evidence we had, but he clearly suspected we had something. And whatever confidence he'd felt while I was sitting in jail was starting to disappear. 3 days later, Victoria called. The prosecutor wanted a meeting. I stared at my phone after the call ended. A week earlier, I'd been sitting in a holding cell wondering whether my life had just been destroyed. Now I was carrying video evidence that could destroy Ethan's entire version of events. The balance finally seemed to be shifting, and Ethan had no idea how quickly things were about to unravel. The meeting with the prosecutor took place the following morning. I barely slept the night before, not because I doubted the footage. By then, I'd watched it enough times to know exactly what it showed. What worried me was everything around it. Would they actually use it? Would they believe it? Would it be enough to undo the damage that had already been done? I kept replaying different scenarios in my head until I finally gave up on sleep altogether. By the time I arrived at the prosecutor's office with Victoria, I was running on caffeine and nerves. The prosecutor was a man in his 50s with the kind of expression that revealed absolutely nothing. He greeted us politely, sat down, and got straight to business. Then he watched the video. Nobody interrupted. Nobody spoke. The room stayed silent for nearly 20 minutes. I spent most of that time studying his face and learning absolutely nothing from it. He didn't react when Ethan shoved me. He didn't react when Ethan slapped me. He didn't react when Ethan threw the picture frame. He simply watched. When the recording finally ended, he leaned back in his chair and folded his hands. For a few seconds, nobody said anything. Then he looked directly at me. "Ms. Bennett, I'm sorry this happened to you." I didn't realize how tense I was until that moment. The air seemed to leave my lungs all at once. Before I could respond, he continued. "The charges against you will be dismissed. Just like that. One sentence that erased the nightmare I'd been carrying around for days. I wish I could say I burst into tears or felt some overwhelming sense of relief. Honestly, I mostly felt tired, exhausted. The kind of exhaustion that settles into your bones after you've been bracing for impact for too long. The prosecutor wasn't finished. Based on the evidence we've reviewed, we're preparing charges against Mr. Parker for assault and filing a false police report. Hearing Ethan's name attached to criminal charges felt surreal. A week earlier, we'd been arguing about grocery lists and weekend plans. Now prosecutors were discussing a case against him. Life can change so fast it almost feels ridiculous afterward. When the meeting ended, Victoria and I walked back toward the parking garage. She looked pleased. Not happy exactly. Satisfied, like someone watching a puzzle finally come together. "You okay?" she asked. "I think so." "You don't sound convinced." I laughed quietly. I don't know what I'm supposed to feel. That's normal. Maybe she was right. Everything had happened so quickly that I hadn't really processed any of it yet. The calls started later that afternoon. Unknown numbers. One after another. The first few went straight to voicemail. Then Rachel texted me. Ethan had started contacting her. Apparently, he'd decided she was the easiest way to reach me. The messages began with apologies. At least they looked like apologies. "Tell Claire I'm sorry. Please tell her to call me. I never wanted this to happen. I miss her." A month earlier, those messages probably would have worked. I would have wanted to believe them. Now they felt different. Less like apologies. More like damage control. Rachel ignored them. I ignored them. The messages kept coming anyway. A few hours later, the tone shifted. The panic became easier to see. "Has she shown anyone the video? Please just ask her." Rachel forwarded that message without comment. She didn't need to say anything. Neither of us missed the significance. Ethan knew something was wrong. He didn't know exactly what we had, but he knew enough to worry. Over the next several days, his behavior became increasingly erratic. The more pressure he felt, the more mistakes he made. At first, it was just messages, then calls, then attempts to contact mutual friends. Some people ignored him, others didn't. Word started spreading. Not the real story. His version. The version where he was the victim. The version where I had somehow ruined his life. I tried not to pay attention. Victoria strongly recommended staying off social media. That advice lasted about 48 hours. Then Rachel sent me screenshots. I shouldn't have looked. I looked anyway. Ethan had started posting vague messages online. Nothing direct enough to create legal trouble. Just carefully crafted statements designed to make people ask questions. Some people can destroy your life and sleep just fine. Healing isn't easy when people refuse to take responsibility. The comments underneath were full of sympathy. Strangers telling him to stay strong. Strangers praising his courage. Strangers who had absolutely no idea what had happened. I stared at the screen longer than I should have. Not because I wanted to respond. Because it was frustrating to watch complete strangers form opinions based on a story that wasn't true. Victoria's response was simple. Leave it alone. He keeps lying. I know. People believe him. They won't matter. I wasn't sure I agreed. At the time, it felt like everybody mattered. Every opinion. Every rumor. Every conversation happening behind my back. Victoria saw things differently. "Claire, he's making this worse for himself." I didn't fully understand what she meant until a week later. That's when Ethan made a mistake big enough that even I couldn't believe it. A local lifestyle blog published an interview with him. The article wasn't particularly famous. It wasn't some major publication, but it was public. And more importantly, it was permanent. I read the entire thing twice. The more I read, the worse it got. Ethan described himself as a survivor. He repeated the same allegations he'd already given police. He suggested he'd been mistreated by the legal system. He implied that powerful people were trying to silence him. The entire article felt detached from reality. I forwarded it to Victoria. Less than 20 minutes later, my phone rang. "Did you read the whole thing?" she asked. Unfortunately, she laughed. It was the first time I'd heard her laugh since we met. "Good." "Good?" "He's helping us." I sat down. "How exactly is this helping?" "Because he just repeated a series of statements that directly contradict recorded evidence." I stared at the article again. When she said it that way, the situation looked very different. The interview wasn't helping Ethan. It was documenting his lies. What made it worse for Ethan was that people were now sharing the article. A few mutual friends who had originally believed his version started asking questions. The more attention the interview received, the more people compared his statements to publicly available court records. Publicly, in writing, with his name attached. And that wasn't the only part of his life starting to unravel. Through mutual friends, I learned that his employer had suspended him pending the outcome of the investigation. Apparently, criminal charges created problems far beyond the courtroom. When Rachel told me, neither of us celebrated. The situation wasn't funny. But there was something strangely ironic about it. A man who'd tried to destroy my credibility was suddenly dealing with questions about his own. Meanwhile, another problem was quietly approaching. Her name was Margaret, Ethan's mother, and she was about to make herself impossible to ignore. Margaret called me on a Tuesday afternoon. At the time, I didn't recognize the number. If I had, I probably wouldn't have answered. I'd spent the previous week trying to rebuild some sense of normalcy. I was back at work, trying to focus on deadlines and meetings instead of court filings and police reports. It wasn't going particularly well, but at least I was trying. My phone rang while I was leaving the office. I answered without thinking. Claire? The voice was unfamiliar. Older. Sharp. I stopped walking. Who's this? This is Margaret, Ethan's mother. I nearly ended the call right there. In hindsight, I should have. Instead, I made the mistake of listening. What you're doing to my son is disgusting. No greeting. No small talk. No attempt at politeness. Just a direct accusation. I leaned against my car and closed my eyes. Somehow that made the conversation easier. Your son assaulted me. No, he didn't. The response came so quickly it felt rehearsed. He absolutely did. He's a good man. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because I'd heard that exact sentence after every terrible thing someone was trying to excuse. I had heard that defense before. Somehow every harmful thing Ethan had done was being explained away as stress, pressure, or a temporary lapse in judgment. Apparently none of that counted. He was scared, she continued. Scared of what? She ignored the question. Instead, she launched into a speech about how Ethan had always been sensitive, how he'd been under stress, how relationships were complicated. Every explanation somehow led back to the same conclusion. Ethan wasn't responsible. Someone else was. Usually me. When I pointed out that he had knowingly filed a false police report, she dismissed it so casually I almost didn't know how to respond. He made a mistake. There it was. The phrase I'd eventually hear from half the people defending him. A mistake. As though he'd accidentally dialed 911. As though he'd accidentally invented a story. As though I'd accidentally spent the night in jail. The conversation continued for almost 10 minutes. The longer it went on, the clearer something became. Margaret wasn't interested in facts. She wasn't interested in evidence. She wasn't interested in what actually happened. She wanted the situation to disappear. More specifically, she wanted me to make it disappear. By the end of the call, she was openly blaming me for the consequences Ethan was facing. His job problems, his legal bills, his stress, his reputation, everything. Apparently, my role in the story was to quietly accept what happened and move on. The fact that I'd been the one arrested didn't seem particularly important to her. Then she said something that stuck with me. It was one night. I frowned. What? You spent one night in jail. The way she said it made it sound insignificant, like she'd caught me exaggerating. Like I was making a big deal out of something minor. One night. I remember standing there beside my car staring into the parking lot. One night. As though fear worked on a timer. As though humiliation disappeared after sunrise. As though watching your entire life get turned upside down somehow became acceptable if it only lasted until morning. That was the moment I stopped trying to reason with her. Nothing I said was going to matter. So I ended the call. Then I blocked the number. Unfortunately, that wasn't the end of it. Over the following days, more calls started appearing. Different numbers. Different people. Friends of Ethan. Distant relatives. People I'd met once at a barbecue 3 years earlier. People who had heard his version of events and decided they knew exactly what happened. Some sounded concerned. Some sounded angry. A few pretended they were just trying to understand both sides. Most of them had already chosen a side before dialing my number. Eventually, I stopped answering unknown calls altogether. Rachel helped screen messages. Victoria documented everything. My parents started blocking numbers too. The entire situation had grown far beyond the original incident. The assault was one issue. The false police report was another. Now there was an entirely separate battle taking place in conversations, text messages, social media posts, and whispered opinions. People were choosing which version of events they wanted to believe. And once people become emotionally attached to a story, changing their minds isn't easy. Around that time, another update arrived. A court notice. The first major hearing had been scheduled. I read the date 3 times. Then I read it again. For weeks, everything had felt uncertain. Now there was finally something concrete. A courtroom. A judge. Evidence. A process. Something real. For the first time since my arrest, I felt like the situation was actually moving forward instead of circling endlessly around the same arguments. The hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning. I arrived almost 40 minutes early. Rachel came with me. Victoria met us there. The courthouse was already busy when we walked through security. People rushed through hallways carrying folders and briefcases. Families sat on benches waiting for hearings. Lawyers moved from room to room with the kind of efficiency that comes from spending years in the same building. I sat outside the courtroom, trying not to think about everything that could go wrong. About 15 minutes before the hearing started, Rachel nudged my arm. "Don't look immediately." Naturally, I looked immediately. Ethan had just entered the hallway, and somehow he looked irritated. Not nervous, not embarrassed. Irritated, as if he couldn't believe he was being inconvenienced. His mother walked beside him. Then I noticed another woman. She looked to be around our age. Blonde, pretty, standing close enough to Ethan that the relationship was obvious. Rachel stared, then looked at me. Seriously? I honestly didn't know what to say. The case hadn't even reached trial. He was facing criminal charges, and somehow he'd found time to start a new relationship. The woman looked completely unaware of the situation she was walking into. Part of me felt sorry for her. A few minutes later, everyone entered the courtroom. The hearing began. Almost immediately, Ethan's attorney started trying to steer attention away from the video. That alone told me a lot. If the footage helped Ethan, they would have wanted everyone watching it. Instead, they focused on context. Misunderstandings, relationship dynamics, emotional stress, anything except the recording itself. Eventually, the judge requested the video. The room became noticeably quieter. I'd seen the footage enough times by then. I wasn't watching the screen. I was watching people. The judge, the attorneys, the clerk, even Ethan's new girlfriend. As the recording played, expressions started changing. The further the video went, the harder it became to defend. As the footage continued, the assault, the staged fall, and the 911 call became harder and harder to defend. None of it looked better on a larger screen. When the footage ended, the silence in the room felt heavy. The judge turned toward Ethan's attorney. "What exactly am I supposed to be seeing differently?" Nobody answered immediately, because there wasn't much to say. The video was the video, and no amount of explanation could make it show something it didn't. The judge's question hung in the room for several seconds. Ethan's attorney eventually stood and attempted another explanation. He talked about context. He talked about emotional reactions. He talked about stress and misunderstandings. The problem was that none of those explanations changed what everyone had just watched. The recording showed Ethan shoving me. The recording showed Ethan striking me. The recording showed Ethan throwing an object. Most importantly, the recording showed exactly what happened before he called the police. The judge listened patiently before turning to the prosecutor. The prosecutor didn't need much time. He presented phone records, text messages, and a timeline showing Ethan's repeated attempts to contact me, despite being told not to. By the time the hearing ended, the atmosphere in the courtroom felt completely different from when it began. Ethan looked shaken. His mother looked furious. His new girlfriend looked confused. The judge denied multiple requests from Ethan's legal team and made it clear that the case would proceed. Outside the courtroom, things got even uglier. Margaret immediately started arguing with anyone who would listen. At one point, she began yelling loudly enough that courthouse security had to step in. Victoria calmly guided me toward the elevators. "Don't engage." I wasn't planning to. At that point, I was too exhausted to argue with anyone. The hearing itself wasn't the end of the case. It was simply the point where reality finally started catching up with Ethan. The actual trial was scheduled several months later. Those months were quieter than the chaos that came before them, but they weren't easy. Depositions had to be completed, attorneys exchanged evidence, and I met with prosecutors several times to prepare for testimony. Work, therapy, and my friends helped me get through it while the case slowly moved toward trial. Meanwhile, Ethan continued making his own situation worse. The social media posts continued. The indirect messages continued. The complaints continued. Every time he spoke publicly, he seemed convinced he could still control the story. Every time he spoke, Victoria saved screenshots. Every interview, every post, every statement. Eventually, the trial date arrived. Walking into court that morning felt different from the hearing. The hearing had been about possibility. The trial felt final. A jury was selected. Witnesses were called. Evidence was presented. The prosecution laid everything out piece by piece. The video, the police report, the phone records, the messages, the timeline. When the recording was played for the jury, I didn't watch the screen. I'd seen it too many times already. Instead, I watched their faces. Nobody looked confused. Nobody looked uncertain. The footage spoke for itself. Several jurors took notes. One juror actually frowned during the portion where Ethan called 911. The prosecutor's case was straightforward. The defense tried to argue that Ethan had felt threatened. They tried to argue that the situation was emotionally complicated. They tried to suggest the recording didn't show the entire relationship. The problem was that none of those arguments explained the discrepancy between what happened and what Ethan reported to police. Eventually, Ethan took the stand himself. That decision turned out to be a disaster. At first, he sounded confident. Then the prosecutor started asking questions. Specific questions. Questions tied directly to timestamps, text messages, and recorded statements. The more Ethan answered, the more contradictions appeared. Small inconsistencies became larger ones. Large inconsistencies became impossible to ignore. At one point, the prosecutor pulled up a statement Ethan had made during his blog interview, then compared it to his police report, then compared both to the video. The courtroom became noticeably quieter. Ethan's confidence disappeared. His answers became shorter, less certain. Several times he claimed he couldn't remember details he had previously described in great detail. Even from across the room, I could see the panic setting in. For months, he'd been controlling the narrative. Now he was trapped inside facts he couldn't explain away. The trial lasted several days. When closing arguments finished, the jury left to deliberate. Waiting for a verdict was one of the hardest parts of the entire experience. Not because I doubted the evidence. Because after everything that had happened, I no longer took anything for granted. I sat beside Rachel in the hallway while we waited. Neither of us talked much. There wasn't anything left to say. Eventually, the jury returned. Everyone stood. The foreperson handed paperwork to the clerk. The judge reviewed it. Then the verdict was read. The jury found Ethan guilty on the major charges. As the verdicts were read aloud, the outcome became impossible to ignore. By the time it was over, Ethan had been convicted on every major count. For a moment, nobody moved. I looked toward Ethan. The expression on his face wasn't anger. It wasn't sadness. It looked more like disbelief, as though he'd spent so long convincing himself he would escape responsibility that he'd never seriously considered any other outcome. His mother started crying almost immediately. The judge ordered silence. Court officers moved into position. Ethan was taken into custody. Just like that. Months of lies, accusations, manipulation, and court appearances ended in a matter of minutes. The sentencing hearing took place several weeks later. The judge reviewed everything. The assault, the false police report, the attempts to contact me afterward, the public statements, the pattern of behavior. When the sentence was announced, nobody looked surprised. It included jail time, probation, mandatory counseling, and financial penalties. The judge was particularly critical of the false report. He made it clear that using law enforcement as a weapon against another person wasn't a minor mistake. It carried real consequences. After sentencing, I expected to feel triumphant. I didn't. Mostly I felt tired, relieved, ready to move forward. The case had consumed nearly a year of my life. I wanted my life back. Over the following months, things gradually became quieter. The calls stopped. The messages stopped. The rumors faded. Work became normal again. I spent more time with family, more time with friends, less time talking to lawyers, less time thinking about courtrooms. Eventually, I moved to a different apartment. Not because I was afraid. I simply didn't want daily reminders of everything that had happened. The last box I unpacked contained the security camera. The same camera I almost forgot existed. The same camera that captured the one thing nobody expected. The same camera that recorded the few minutes that ended up changing the entire case. I held it for a moment before placing it on a shelf. It's funny. When I bought that camera, I thought I was protecting my apartment. I had no idea it would end up protecting my future. And whenever people ask how I managed to prove what happened, I always think back to that tiny device sitting quietly on a bookshelf while my entire life was falling apart. The best money I ever spent wasn't on furniture, electronics, or anything impressive. It was on a simple security camera that happened to be pointed in the right direction at exactly the right time. Life slowly settled down after that, and for the first time in months, courtrooms stopped being the center of my world. About a year after the sentencing, Rachel called me on a Saturday morning. I was unpacking groceries in my new apartment when my phone rang. The moment I saw her name, I answered. "What's up?" "You'll never guess who I ran into." I laughed. "I'm not playing that game." "Ethan's former girlfriend." I stopped what I was doing. Not because I still cared about Ethan. Honestly, by then, I rarely thought about him at all. It was just a name from a chapter of my life I'd worked very hard to leave behind. "What happened?" Rachel hesitated for a second. Apparently, she left him not long after the trial. That didn't surprise me. "What surprised me," Rachel continued, "is that she told me she didn't know the full story when they started dating." I leaned against the kitchen counter. The poor woman suddenly made a lot more sense. I'd never forgotten the expression on her face during the hearing. while everyone else in the courtroom looked defensive, angry, or frustrated. She looked confused, like someone realizing she had walked into the middle of a story nobody had bothered to explain. What changed her mind? I asked. The video. Of course. The same answer it had always been. Rachel told me the woman eventually reviewed the court records herself. Once she saw the footage and read the case documents, the relationship ended quickly. After we hung up, I found myself thinking about that conversation longer than I expected. Not because of Ethan, because of how many people had formed opinions before they knew what happened. Some people changed their minds after learning what really happened. Others never did. Eventually, I stopped worrying about either group. A few months later, another piece of news reached me through mutual friends. Ethan's job never came back. Several mutual friends stopped speaking to him altogether. The people who had defended him the loudest were suddenly nowhere to be found. The suspension eventually became a termination. The combination of criminal convictions, court records, and public behavior had done more damage than he ever expected. The strange thing was that hearing about it didn't make me happy. A year earlier, I probably would have thought it would. Instead, I mostly felt distant from it, like hearing news about someone I used to know a long time ago. The anger had faded. The fear had faded too. What remained was perspective. The person who had consumed every waking thought for nearly a year had gradually become irrelevant to my daily life. That realization felt better than revenge ever could. The final piece of closure came a few weeks later. My attorney forwarded an official notice confirming that every charge connected to my arrest had been fully dismissed and cleared. I already knew that. Legally, it had been resolved months earlier. But holding the document in my hands felt different. It was tangible, final, real. That evening, I sat on the balcony of my apartment watching the city lights come on one by one. No lawyers, no court dates, no evidence folders, no phone calls from unknown numbers. Just a quiet evening. As I sat there, I realized I was spending more time thinking about what came next than what had happened before. I thought about the version of myself sitting in that jail cell, terrified that one terrible night was going to define the rest of her life. If I could have spoken to her back then, I probably would have told her that the next year was going to be difficult. I would have told her there would be court dates, lawyers, and plenty of days when she wanted the whole thing to disappear. But I also would have told her that she was going to be okay, even if she couldn't see it yet. Then I went back inside, locked the door, and continued unpacking boxes. Just another ordinary evening. Exactly the kind of ordinary evening I used to take for granted.